Welcome to the Dimitri Lascaris report on the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires, coming to you from Baltimore. Prime Minister of Greece, Alexis Tsipras, is saying that Greece is being singled out when it comes to debt negotiations. By that, he means that nation-states in similar situations, such as Ireland, Portugal, and Ukraine, for example, did not receive the same level of scrutinization or reprisal when it comes to their debt negotiations. Further, the Greek lenders are also calling for a surplus of 1% this year, which analysts say would require a lot of austerity measures. They then want to see a surplus of 2% in 2016 and 3% in 2017 to reach 3.5% of GDP by 2018. Yet, Greece has tabled measures to address the debt, which is not being accepted by the lenders. Joining us now from London to discuss all of this is Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri is a partner with the Canadian law firm Siskins, where he heads the firm's securities class action practice. Dimitri, welcome back to the Real News Network.
Always a pleasure, Sharmini.
So let's begin by talking about what's on the table. What has Greece tabled in terms of the solution here?
Well, the number that's probably the most important to look at is the primary surplus targets, which you mentioned. And as you've indicated, Greece has agreed to a primary surplus of 1% this year, 2% 2016, 3% 2017, and 3.5% from 2018 to 2022. The primary surplus is essentially the government revenues minus its expenses when interest on the national debt is excluded, and this is the number that drives all the other policies. So, you're quite correct that the IMF and the EC and the ECB and Greece are in agreement now on what those targets should be. Greece has essentially accepted what the troika demanded. The difference between them, and particularly between the IMF and Greece, is as to whether the specific proposals, revenue generating and expenditure slashing proposals, will result in Greece achieving those surplus targets. And Greece says they will, and the IMF says they won't. And the primary bones of contention are around pensions and taxation. And so before I go into those two subjects, I want to say one thing. Greece is currently projected to post a 0.7% deficit this year, and we're halfway through the year. So for Greece to achieve in 2015 a 1% primary surplus, it would have to engage in quite severe forms of austerity for the balance of the year. And this would be done in an economy, as we all know, that is deeply depressed, where the unemployment rate is higher than it was at the height of the Great Depression in the United States in the 30s. It's at 26.6%. The economy has experienced since 2010 a 27% contraction, which is the greatest economic contraction in peacetime suffered by a developed state ever. And so for the government to have to engage in extreme forms of austerity in these circumstances is quite extraordinary. But as I say, the IMF is not satisfied that the measures being proposed by Greece will help it to achieve that primary surplus of 1% this year and going forward, the other targets that have been agreed to. So that takes us to the main bones of contention, and the first one is pensions. In order to achieve a savings of 1% of GDP, or 1.8 billion euros starting in 2016, which is what the IMF has demanded, the IMF wants a complete overhaul of the pension reforms, or so-called reforms, that were proposed by Greece in an 11-page document submitted to the Troika on Monday of this week. And it's specifically, rather than gradually raising the effective retirement age to 67 by 2025, as Athens had proposed, the IMF wants the increase in the retirement age accelerated to 2022. Originally, Athens had shot for an acceleration by 2036. So when it agreed to 2025, it was already making a very significant concession, but the IMF is not satisfied with that. The IMF plan would also allow for retirement at 62 for only those persons who had paid into the pension system for 40 years. So that would really affect a small percentage of the population. Effectively, everyone, the vast majority of the population would be subjected to a retirement age of 67 by 2022 if the IMF has its way. The IMF also is demanding the phase out of something called a solidarity grant, which is a special top-up payment given to the poorer pensioners. It wants that phased out by 2017. The original Greek proposal started the phase out in 2018 and would have abolished it by 2020. Let's recall that pensions have been decreased in Greece by 40% since 2010, and that 45% of pensioners in Greece are receiving a pension that places them below the poverty line. So again, this phase out would hit poor pensioners quite hard.
That is being reflected on the streets of Athens as we speak. Can you comment on that as well, and then end your point, what you were about to say?
Sure. As word began to leak out that the Syriza government was going to capitulate on its red line on pensions, pensioners in Greece, quite understandably, became irate and began to converge on Athens. In the last couple of days, there were buses coming in from the countryside, from smaller urban centers to the capital, and there was a protest in central Athens by thousands of pensioners, many of whom were saying, quite movingly, we have been placed on the brink of poverty. Many of us are living in poverty, and to subject us to further cuts is simply inhumane, and we won't stand for it. And some aged, quite older pensioners were quoted in the press. They were in tears, and it was really a rather heartbreaking situation. When the IMF says, as it has said in the last few weeks, that it isn't seeking to impose further burdens on the poorest pensioners, that's simply not true. The effect of these measures will be to hit those pensioners very hard. And, it's really I think a testimony to the extraordinary pressure that the Greek government is under, that despite its progressive leanings, it has been prepared to accede to this. And nonetheless, the IMF is not satisfied.
So in a rapid de-escalation in terms of Syriza's commitment to the people and having been elected only for the last 6 months, it has come to this in terms of their offering up cuts and austerity in order to resolve the situation. Why are they being so desperate in what they're tabling as far as Syriza is concerned here?
Well, if you're referring to why Syriza appears to be desperate, I think that's because the leadership of the party, and this is not true, I think, of the left wing of the party, the leadership of the party seems to be persuaded that a refusal to accede to these demands, these rather inhumane demands by the troika, will result in no further bailout monies being advanced to Greece, which would precipitate a default on Greece's debt, and that would likely result in Greece being expelled or forced to withdraw from the Eurozone and possibly from the European Union as well. And they are convinced, the leadership of Syriza, that this would be a worse outcome for the population of Greece than acceding to these demands. And as I've said many times, I think they're quite mistaken about that. There would be short-term pain. There's no doubt about that. But a well-planned withdrawal from the Eurozone, which would include capital controls, nationalization of the banking system, would, in the longer run, enable the Greek government to devalue its currency, to increase the competitiveness of Greek exports, to regain sovereignty over its social policies, its social spending, and would have great benefits for the population on a long-term basis. Unfortunately, the leadership of the party is not of that view, and they are inclined to select what they regard as the lesser of two evils, which is capitulation, unfortunately.
And is there any thinking on the part of the Syriza leadership that this is a temporary stopgap measure and then they're buying time, which is what a lot of people on the left are hoping for?
Well, the question is what is going to, that may well be their thinking, but the question is what is going to be achieved in the months ahead if they capitulate to these demands. There's really no reasonable prospect, in my view, that the core countries of the Eurozone who dictate the direction of the Eurozone, namely Germany, France, and other economies of the North, for example, the Netherlands, are going to alter their attitude towards the question of austerity. Even within the so-called social democratic parties of the core states, Germany, France, the Netherlands, there is, I think, a diehard commitment to a fundamentally neoliberal perspective on these issues and the whole concept of austerity. So that even if, for example, Merkel's party were to be replaced by the Social Democrats in Germany, you wouldn't see a substantive change. You would have a continuation of these policies. And in fact, in France, you have a supposedly left-wing party in power, and they have been demanding these concessions from Greece and, in effect, an agreement with the government of Angela Merkel. So what is going to happen in the next several months or years that will make the playing field more favorable for Syriza and parties, other anti-austerity parties in Europe? I don't see that happening, unfortunately. So I don't think there's any real benefit in trying to buy a few months of time, or a few months of time, or even a few years of time. And in fact, there are structural defects in the Eurozone. That's widely acknowledged, and there's no political will on the part of the Eurozone to rectify those structural defects. And in fact, what you need to do that is a much higher level of political and economic integration. There's just no appetite for that within the political elite in the core countries. And absent a much higher degree of integration, political and economic, ultimately the Eurozone will collapse. The monetary union will not survive. And so one has to ask, what ultimately is Syriza trying to achieve by keeping the country within the Eurozone for the time being? So I think these are very big picture questions that the government has to ponder very carefully. And in the interim, it's continuing to make concessions, more severe concessions, concessions that are ultimately going to increase poverty within Greece, increase the debt to GDP ratio, decrease the sustainability of Greek debt, and the longer term benefits of that are highly questionable at this stage.
Perhaps we should have a debate on this issue of accepting the lender's terms or exiting in our next session with you, Dimitri.
Yes, and I would welcome that, and I think that that's fundamentally the problem, Sharmini, in Greece, that there hasn't been a mature, objective debate about a Grexit. And until that debate happens, the population is not in a position to make an informed choice about whether it's better off in or outside of the Eurozone.
So let's take that up in our next discussion. Dimitri, thank you so much for joining us.
Will do. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.